Well, fabulous. Thank you all so much for being here. Again, please hop into the chat. So usually how these are structured is that I'll kind of drive the conversation with questions for about 20 to 30 minutes, then we open up to Q&A and have this conversation about the book. Which is such a wonderful book. And I listened to the audiobook as well, which was interesting because I just did my audiobook for my forthcoming book. And how did you find that process? Because you did have to like with recipes, you were like go see the PDF and I was like that's so awkward. But did you like the audiobook process?
I thought the audiobook was actually harder than writing the book.
That's so interesting. This is my new question for writers because now that I've done it, I'm like, and I was talking to my agent in the middle of it, and I was like, I'm having a great time. I loved it. I like had such a good time.
Yeah, it's usually the first time that an author reads their book cover to cover
Yes.
for the first time.
Yes.
And so you discover different things and it sounds different coming out and having it have yourself in your ear for an entire
Yes.
week is a little bit cloying.
No,
So
I mean, I definitely found like things I would have changed. And
yeah.
it just
Oh,
kind of it solidified my like, okay, I have to really commit to reading my work out loud because even if I think I'm really getting into it and breaking it down, there is nothing like just hearing it and being like, what the hell was I doing?
yeah, exactly, exactly.
But this book, The Last Sweet Bite, can we start by getting a little bit of background on how you got into human rights research, how you got into that work, how that work still manifests in your life, and et cetera?
Sure. Yeah, I had always been drawn to kind of public service in a lot of ways, and I credit my parents to that, who are physicians and nurses and had treated their jobs as public service.
Hmm.
I did not want to be a doctor, but I had kind of that idea of giving back to my community and kind of ingrained in me as a child.
Hmm.
And the thing as I through college, I didn't really like college very much. I ended up leaving my junior year and went to Japan for my senior year. And I started actually doing a lot of reading on kind of international conflicts. And I was really I came across these kind of interesting people who are working for the UN or for different governments who were kind of you never really read about in the papers, but are doing the hard work of bringing warring parties together to the
Yeah.
negotiating table to end the conflict. And I always thought that's a really fascinating line of work. And so at the same time, the Balkan Wars were happening. And so kind of I was kind of watching that and learning about the people that were kind of ending those wars and that genocide. And I decided to apply to graduate school to do similar work.
Hmm.
And my third day at graduate school after it started, September 11th happened. And my 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 graduate school is kind of geared toward getting you into like the State Department, into like the mainstream types of international development and conflict work.
Yeah.
And pretty soon after that, after September 11th and how those wars were prosecuted, I was like, there's no way I could go work for the Bush administration. Like
Yeah.
I was on the street protesting against the war. There's no way I could do that. I didn't really like at that time, international relations programs didn't really push you towards careers in kind of towards like human rights investigations, like the Human Rights Watches of the world, the Amnesty Internationals or International Crisis Group or Oxfam that are slightly or MSF. That they didn't really have a language to talk about that. I had to kind
Hmm.
of figure that out for myself. And I ended up uh, searching for these organizations and emailing people in them. I'm like, how do I get into this? And one guy responded to me. He's like, hey, we have an internship in the Asia program in New York City. Would you like to work on that? And
Hmm.
I went to New York after graduate school, after kind of a brief stint in Western China. I went to go teach English for a year after in Xinjiang after graduate school to kind of help figure out what I wanted to do. And that's when I started emailing these organizations. And I ended up doing some slave labor in New York City and going in a lot of debt to work on uh, for this great organization called the International Crisis Group. And the guy who was the Afghanistan analyst quit within 3 months of my internship, and they asked me if I would go fill in, and just
Wow.
hold down the fort in Kabul.
Yeah.
And I had had a I my family's background, at least half of my family's background is South Asian,
Okay.
Pakistani, and we had spent a lot of time there. So even though Afghanistan and Pakistan are completely different places, I had a cultural fluency in some
Yeah.
ways. And I went there and I put my heart and soul into studying the country and learning about everything and learning Dari. And the great thing about working for an NGO at that time in Afghanistan is that I didn't have any restrictions on me, for better or worse. I was able to take taxis and move around. I didn't have to live behind a compound walls. And so it was a really kind of fascinating experience. And kind of again, like those 3 days, after I started graduate school, September 11th happened. I think it was about 3 weeks into my time in Kabul that I was really challenged by, or what, let me put it this way, I was the narrative of the omnipotency of the Defense Department, the CIA, the State Department, um, America in general, about when they go into places and kind of even with, ostensibly good intentions to help rebuild, like
Yeah.
they didn't know shit. And they spent all this money and they just were behind these walls and they couldn't get out and they were only talking to themselves. And I realized I had more information and knew about more about Afghanistan in 3 weeks than they had been there for almost 3 years at that point. And it was really really kind of shook my understanding of what I had learned.
Yeah.
And I just ended up staying in Kabul for about 3 or 4 years, working for International Crisis Group, doing kind of political analysis, and then kind of shifted over to Human Rights Watch because during my time at ICG, I was it was impossible not to come in contact with direct victims of violence, particularly U.S. airstrikes and then Taliban attacks. And I was seeing that really human impact of my country's um, combat operations on innocent civilians. And I wanted to kind of document I wanted to tell that story to
Yeah.
Americans. And so
Yeah.
I ended up moving over to Human Rights Watch to do more direct human rights investigations into war crimes, mostly, and mostly
Yeah.
looking at how to reduce civilian harm from America's combat operations in Afghanistan. And from there, my kind of like career just moved on. I developed an expertise in that in Afghanistan, ended up doing similar work in Sri Lanka, and the end of the civil war there, work in Bangladesh around multiple violent coups, Pakistan, the tribal areas, and the Obama's drone wars, Syria. As well, and a little bit of work in Mali after that. But most of my work has been focused kind of on South and Southeast Asia, Thailand as well. But yeah,
Right.
it's kind of the short of the long how I got into it, but driven a lot by kind of the values my parents kind of instilled in me and the travel that we did, and then my desire to do that, but also kind of wanting to be able to tell a story about what I was seeing to my own country about what
Right.
its impacts were. So that's yeah, and then I ended up
Yeah.
working for the UN too. I ended up investigating the Rohingya genocide for the UN. That was kind of my last real um, human rights job per se, but
Mm-hmm.
a formal human rights job. But I ended up going working for the New York City mayor's office, and interesting had this like 5 year job of helping to run the climate office. But my job was to integrate human rights principles into um, the climate infrastructure that the city was building. So, I mean, Robert Moses, as we probably all know, kind of really screwed over a lot of black and brown people, pushed them to the edges, and that's where all the climate infrastructure had to be built. And so, it was just going to compound misery upon misery. And so, my job was to really kind of figure out how to make, like, not just do no harm, but to do better with that money.
Right.
So,
Yeah. No, I love how in the book and right now you're connecting all of these things between, not just war and genocide, but colonialism and climate change and language and then that leads, of course, to the cuisine as well.
yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of that
Yeah.
process, so how it all like to come back to the food angle of all this. During those moments of investigating war crimes mostly, or crimes against humanity, depending on the context. I often conducted these interviews over a meal.
Yeah.
When you're asking someone, when you're investigating a war crime or crime against humanity and talking to a victim or an eyewitness, you're usually asking them to recount the worst moments of their life. And it's
Yeah.
pretty painstaking and painful for them and also for the person receiving that information, I'll say, like on
Yeah.
my end, and my colleagues who are with me. And it takes a long time. The interviews can take hours, if not days, sometimes. But I often did them over a meal,
Yeah.
as a way to kind of break up the conversations, as a way for us to have something momentarily to focus on outside of the violence.
Yeah.
Um, and inevitably, people would ask me how I got this food, or they would see something that they had not eaten in a while. And
Right.
they would start telling me stories about how these dishes were disappearing. I was like, what do you mean they're disappearing? And we would get into these conversations about the duration of war. And in Afghanistan, they had been fighting for 30 years, almost prior to the
Yeah.
American occupation. And millions of Afghans had left and had taken all this culinary knowledge with them.
Yeah.
They had been impoverished, so they were unable to buy ingredients when they were available. There was so much unexploded ordnance in fields, bombs that had not gone off that it was too dangerous to farm. So it just was really hard to kind of keep your cuisine moving. And inevitably, I had people rip notebooks out of my hands, or my tell my translators to like write down a recipe that they didn't want forgotten. It was like a gift. It was all,
Yeah.
in many ways a gift. And it's like, please take this out of the war zone so it won't be forgotten. Um, and there was a moment again in Afghanistan where we're having this conversation, and earlier on the way there, I had driven past, a dozen UNESCO workers, the UN agency that's responsible for protecting heritage at all times and
Yeah.
rebuilding churches and mosques and museums that are destroyed in wartime. And here they are rebuilding this beautiful old minaret and spending millions of dollars doing this. And then later on, this woman was giving me her family recipe and telling me about it. And she was describing it as it was a living being and how
Yeah.
it being forgotten and lost was like losing a family member. And kind
Yeah.
of you start to see how I started to see in those moments and that how important our culinary cultures are to us.
Yeah.
They're almost important as like those old churches and mosques and museums. And here we're spending all this money on protecting that form of culture. And probably one of the most important forms of culture beyond language was getting no protection in
Yeah.
times of war. And so I saw this over the course of 20 years and just, you know, it took me a while and I feel a little bit ashamed it took me so long to come to this. Is like, how do we stop that? How
Yeah.
do we raise food and put it on par with other forms of culture? And in asking that question, I began to see the reasons why.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has to do with misogyny, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
The the rules of war were written by old rich white guys in Europe, mainly in northern Western Europe, and they had never really considered culture in war. And then when we were forced to consider attacking cultural heritage in war, they only looked at physical
Yeah.
uh, things. And while food may have been raised, it wasn't seen as rising to the level of protection because it was mostly done by women and girls. I mean, and women and girls across the world are basically the load bearing pillars of culinary culture. And so it just occurred to me as I'm doing this, and it occurred to others, not just me, but if you really want to protect food culture and war, we need to be better at protecting women and girls in war.
Yes.
And it's not hard. I mean, that's the objective of the book is to get not food not food culture protected outside of war. It's really about, when conflict breaks out, thinking about protecting this aspect of culture. And it
Yeah.
can be done through both policy and legal mechanisms. And I think one of the more profound legal mechanisms is, you know, outlawing this thing called domicide.
Hmm.
And domicide is um, this crime of intentionally destroying neighborhoods and cities like Gaza, Mariupol, Aleppo, Mungdaw. Basically, what happened to most of Native American communities here in the United States and elsewhere, this idea of just this flattening entire villages, homes, and villages should be a war crime, and it's not. And when you think about it, where do women and girls spend most of their time? In the homes, in their neighborhoods, in the markets. And so outlawing the crime of domicide right away would do a lot to be able to protect the physical infrastructure in which we make our culture, our
Right.
food culture, to protecting women and girls. And there are many other ways to do this. And also I started to see in the course of this 20 years, another thing that I really want, I'm starting trying to push now with policymakers is that um, attacks on cultural heritage and particularly food can presage attacks on people.
Yeah.
And when the powerful really want to undermine or erase people, they will intentionally attack its food culture. And I had not
Yes.
appreciated that until I really started researching this book. I mean, the founding fathers, if you look, they're on the record saying lead is this white of the United States. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, like they were clear about how they're going to destroy Native
Yeah.
Americans, attacking their food cultures. But that is happening today in Western China. That
Yeah.
had been in we're talking about it now in the context of Gaza, but it had been happening a long before um,
7th.
October 7th. Um, and so I wanted to, trying to get those that are looking at genocide prevention. There's this tool called the 10 stages of genocide that those that are really paying attention to genocide, I'm trying to get them to include this as maybe the 11th step, right? Like
Yeah.
looking at how the powerful are attacking food as potentially, presaging attacks on people and limiting food,
Yeah.
limiting how people can grow it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, those that's kind of the big things I was trying to do with this book. But through that, oh, sorry, my alarm's going. But the kind of the third component of the last sweet bite is to um, you know, just raise the importance in a more popular way of how our culinary cultures are so important to us.
Yes.
And using recipes and food to tell the stories of people that don't make it on the front pages of the New York Times. And yeah, basically a bit of a using food as a bit of a Trojan horse to talk about human rights issues.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
um, so yeah,
No.
that's it in a nutshell.
Well, what a nutshell. Are you drinking a martini? No, that's
No, I'm
what.
just drinking water out of a fancy glass.
I'm like, oh my God, I should have I didn't get the memo. But so I also obviously I relate a lot of things to Puerto Rico, but as you're talking about this, it's all my brain is just like the way that colonialism has been enacted upon Puerto Rico in terms
Mm,
of like demeaning agricultural work as a way of
right.
ripping people from their food culture and then giving people imported food and saying this is better, this is what you should be eating, to the point where like I'm always losing my mind because people are like, oh, it's so expensive to go to the supermarket and buy all these strawberries which don't grow here and that sort of a thing, but it's very much it's been constructed over time that that is a better way to eat and that is how you do things, and these foods are worth more than the foods that are grown here, and it's this slow process. It's not necessarily, this active destruction, but there's something to that as well, and that's why I was really I loved your the chapter on the Puebla and on New Mexico, and I feel like those are so important for us to think about in the US right now, and probably in other places as well, is how is food culture being used against us even now to kind of
Hmm.
make us think a certain way or behave a certain way or believe a certain way about what food is supposed to be. And I mean, obviously we just had like the big flipping of the food pyramid thing.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
and it's like, and that's, that's an act against our culinary or against culinary culture in general, or against like the idea of belief. I feel like it's a very American thing to just not believe culinary culture is important, because I do think that it's so, if you don't believe it important, as you're saying, then you don't have to protect it, and you don't have to protect women and girls, and you don't have to like, you know, be anti-war, anti-genocide, because you see it as these things as so meaningless,
Right.
and yeah,
There's this, in the international human rights world, the term cultural genocide is kind of looked down upon, right?
right,
There's genocide, like it's only if people are killed does kind of some sort of legal mechanism kick in, right?
right,
But attacks on culture are not necessarily penalized. I mean, you can blow up an old church or old mosque in war intentionally, and it's a crime. It's a
right,
it's a war crime. But you're attacking a building. You're when you go after a culture, and then that's Raphael Lemkin, who is one of the fathers of the Genocide Convention. He originally envisioned cultural genocide as being the coup de grace of crimes.
right,
And it's kind of gotten like when you talk about cultural genocide amongst human rights lawyers, they kind of like scoff at you. But the thing is that culture is the game,
right,
right? If you control the culture, you control the economy, you control society, the social fabric and behavior of society. The politics, everything flows downhill from culture. And I mean, like you just brought it up. I mean, what's happening in the United States is the prime example of this. Donald Trump is not a political project. MAGA is not a political project. It is a cultural project,
yeah,
and he is trying to determine the direction of American culture, and like many authoritarians do around the world. And so,
yeah,
yeah, I mean, this is another thing that I'm constantly harping on, and like we got to think bigger about genocide, if and it gets into that kind of colonial mindset again about the reason why cultural genocide and not just colonial mindset, this misogynistic mindset about
yeah.
how the international legal system is set up.
Yeah. Well, how did this become a book? I think this is I mean, I feel like it's an annoying question to ask an author,
Sure.
because it's like a million years of work and thinking have led to this moment, and the right set of circumstances in terms of all these other machinations. But for you, how was the process of thinking, you know what, this is a book? And also, I really wanted to know, how did you decide how to focus the chapters,
Oh,
and why? Yeah.
great question. Great questions. So I had thought about this book after those kind of conversations I was discussing about in Afghanistan. I hadn't envisioned like a narrative book like this.
Yeah.
I envisioned like I was hanging around with a lot of war photographers at the time. So I was kind of envisioning I'll work with them, we'll take some really beautiful pictures, and we'll have like one page of a story about a family or a province and a recipe, like a big
Yeah.
kind of coffee table kind of cookbook, right? And
Hmm.
then I got so busy with other jobs, like it just kind of dropped away. But the the idea of how violence was changing cuisine was just sticking with me
Yeah.
all throughout my uh, all throughout my kind of career for the over 20 years. And finally, it just I started collecting all of these stories. And I don't know, I don't know if I've ever told this to my mom or in front of my mom, but so whenever I go home, so my father is Sindhi Pakistani, and whenever I go home, I usually cook Pakistani food for him, Sindhi food, and when I have time. But one time I decided to cook something else South Asian.
Hmm.
And there's a recipe in the book, this crab curry, and I wanted it's my when we lived in the old Edgewater house. I cooked this crab curry for my dad and this Elam Tamil curry, and I put it in front of him, and he kind of like raised his nose. I was like, "What is this?" And because it had coconut milk and curry
Huh.
leaf. And we don't use, and Cindy Cooking doesn't use coconut milk and curry leaf. And he tasted it and he's like, oh, this is interesting. And he started asking a lot of questions. And, over the course of that night, like I started to tell him about, he was asking questions about how'd you learn how to make this? And who taught it to you? And I was able to tell him the story about the woman Rajiva in the book and tell him a little bit
Yeah.
about my work, which was always it's hard to explain sometimes. But,
Yeah.
um, and it brought up these two women who were kind of formative in my very young life, who were Elam Tamil refugees who were my preschool teachers and my babysitters that my parents would drop us off at. And like I was able to start connecting all these different parts of my life. But kind of in that moment, I saw like the power of food to tell a good story, right? And like
Yeah.
explain myself in a different way. And that had stuck with me over a few years. And then um, I just decided that it was time to write it down. And when I started
Yeah.
writing it down, I gave it to a book agent. She's like, "Hey, there's something here." And so over the course of, the pandemic, I was able to kind of write a little bit about it, and it eventually just became. I didn't intend to write this book. It just became the book.
Right.
And there were a few more chapters in the book that I wanted there that aren't in it. But to your second question, um, how did I choose which ones were in there? Mostly what's in here are places that I've lived and worked that I had a familiarity with. The one exception being the Pueblo nations.
Yeah.
I had never lived and worked among and with any member of the Pueblo Nation. But if I was going to write a book about how violence changes cuisine, I needed to talk about my own country and turn the mirror on it. And that seemed to be the most direct way of doing that. And I coincidentally befriended a chef just, just out of pure accident and luck. And we became friends, and I just became friends with their family. And over the course of 3 or 4 years, that I started writing that chapter first. It took
Yeah.
me the longest to write because I had to build a lot of trust with that family as an outsider to be able to stay on the reservation, to go there to meet people, and for them to open up and talk about what was really happening, not just in terms of what happened with Spanish colonialism and American colonialism, but now this kind of nuclear colonialism that they're facing and how
Yeah.
kind of sensitive it is to them.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's mostly all these chapters are places I've lived and work, and that I could write fast to meet
Yeah.
a publisher's timeline. But there were like 3 or 4 chapters that I had to cut that I really wanted in here but at some point, there's only so much I think an audience can take about death and destruction. So,
Well, honestly, I will say, and I think it's obvious, like hearing you speak now too, is you bring your character that you create, like the Michael speaking in the book, the persona, is a very likable tour guide through
oh, thank
these
you.
horrible situations. And I think that you did a really great job in the introduction presenting yourself as such, building up who you are and your connections, and then using that through the book. And you're not afraid of being like self-deprecating when it's necessary. You're not afraid of not knowing things, which is a very likable trait and can sometimes be difficult to find in in some people, especially writers. And I think that
Thank you.
that persona really makes it so. Obviously we're getting into the darkest areas of what happens among human beings, but it's also, yeah, your presence makes it, I think, um worthwhile and not as daunting as it could be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I did not know how to write. My book agent,
Yeah.
Alice, was really good at like, you got to write yourself into the book,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And I had never, my entire career, you know, I'm writing human rights reports, right? You're
Right.
never talking about yourself. And
Yeah.
from the nuts and bolts of writing a book, that was kind of the hardest thing to do, was to write myself into it in a way that, it wasn't about me. Like I was
Yeah.
there, but it was about everybody else, not about me.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I mean, it came out too, I think, almost around the time of Hawa Hassan's, right, setting the table for us
Yeah,
too.
fantastic book.
Yeah, so I do, and also as you're talking about indigenous cuisine, I'm thinking about Turtle Island, which came
Yeah.
out from, and so I think it's an interesting moment in terms of these discussions and how food is in and its ability to help people look at these issues in a way that is, not palpable but tolerable and sort of humanizing in the way that it needs to be. But that also reminds me of because I really loved the chapter about coca and
Yeah.
in Bolivia and the Andes and folks, drop your questions in the chat or raise your hand or anything you need to do to get at my attention. But and I loved how you wrestled with the complexity of these things, right? Like how, especially as food people, especially as like we really like nice things and we like and we find it so exciting when someone is like taking a traditional ingredient and doing a cool thing with it and like we're like but you have to question like okay like what is this excitement coming from and you do that in that chapter. So like how did you kind of grapple with the significance of sort of artisanal foods and fine dining and traditional preservation of foods? How did you think about that?
Yeah. So I I am not like one I'm not one for this book is not about preserving
Right,
cultural traditions in amber, right? As
right,
I
right,
think you
right.
went like
Yeah.
there was one and like I'll have to like there was the best way to for me to kind of explain it was this Uyghur chef who said like listen, Uyghur cuisine is going to change when it
Yeah.
runs up against another culture like the Han culture. We expect our culture to change. But we want it to change on our terms, not on the terms of an invading army, right? That's essentially what one of the bigger messages is I try to convey in this book
Yeah.
is it's not like I don't like I find kind of arguments about food authenticity a little bit distracting.
Yes. Yes.
Um, but yeah, that like gets to a bit of the coca um, the Bolivia chapter as well. I've been kind of thinking about the U.S. impact, the U.S. drug wars impact on Andean food cultures, and I had read these articles over the course of a few years about chefs in Colombia and Bolivia, chefs in Peru and Colombia in particular, cooking with coca
Yeah.
leaf. And I'll be honest, I thought it was a bit gimmicky. And I was like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I was like, okay, what's going on? And I started um researching and I had a connection to some people in Bolivia and particularly the Andean oh God, it's an Andean a local Andean human rights organization. It's slipping my mind. It's Catherine oh God, what's Catherine's last name? Anyway, the moment you're supposed to remember a friend's last name,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
forget it.
Yeah.
It'll come to me. The Andean Information Network. Anyway, I've been talking to them, and it's like come on down, and we'll help you see this in a broader context. And I I remember I went to this restaurant Gustu,
Yes.
and it was one of the first restaurants that I ate at, and it's a very high end restaurant that a few Bolivians can eat. And Marcia Taha was the executive chef there, Marcia Taha Mohammed. And she was cooking with coca leaf. And and she had done it in a way to challenge you, right? To
Yeah.
challenge um, your your preconceived notions of coca.
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. Like most Andeans, indigenous Andeans, coca leaf had been used for centuries, millennia, as an indigenous plant, a sacred plant, in a lot of different ways. People chew it every single day as habit for a little bit of energy, taste, culture. It is sacred to Pachamama
Hmm.
in the Quechua traditions and it had been stigmatized to the drug war. This conflation of coca leaf, this old indigenous sacred plant, with cocaine, which coca leaf you pull the cocaine alkaloid from it, but it takes hundreds of pounds of coca leaf to make an ounce of cocaine. It's like ridiculous. And you'll hear across the Andes, like you can chew as many grapes as you want, but you're not going to get drunk.
Right,
It's the
right.
same thing. You can chew as much cocaine as you want, and you're not going to get a coca leaf, and you're not going to get high.
Yeah, yeah.
But there had like the drug war over the course of 50, 60 years, and the US and the UN conflating, the UN drug treaties conflating coca and coca leaf had really stigmatized the legal uses of coca leaf. And
Right.
particularly amongst the wealthy who were closer, who had connections to North America.
Hmm.
And they had looked down on coca leaf chewing as like a bad, like a dirty habit of the peasants. And but you had these chefs who were starting to cook with it as a way to challenge those notions
Right.
and as a way to like use it as a form of resistance, which I didn't understand until I got there.
Yeah.
And Marcia had kept the coca leaf, how we ate it. She had lightly fried it in coca leaf oil, and she made it with this coca leaf infused butter and this coca infused bread. It was beautiful, but she served the leaf whole, right? It was my first time kind of engaging with coca leaf, and it forced you to engage with all those preconceived notions about it, which
Right.
I thought was really fascinating. And here was this restaurant, Gustu, that was doing that, and I was like, at the same time, most people can't afford this.
Yeah.
And so I started asking this question about kind of appropriation of local and indigenous ingredients and the high-end restaurants using them,
Right.
and not kind of giving credit where credit is deserved. And over the course of about a month of moving through different regions of Bolivia, but mostly the Chapare, the one of the largest coca growing regions in the Bolivia, and where the most violent aspect of the U.S. drug war transpired in Bolivia, I got a very different view of that.
Yeah.
Um, and I had met with many, many women who led these protests for of the MAS, the movement towards socialism, which was in power until recently. But they had basically waged a peasant revolt for a very long time, and they were coca growers themselves
Yeah.
against kind of the drug war, and it was often women led, and they had put years and years of their lives fighting against the military, fighting against kind of things that look like ice on the streets of Minneapolis right now. Um, to preserve their culture, for their right to grow uh their own plants.
Yeah.
They didn't want it to divert it to the elite, to the illicit drug market. They wanted to use it for their own, for themselves, and like everyone else, like other places had, and they won that right when Moss came to power. Um and they wanted to, as a way to divert, make sure that people could grow coca leaf um, without it being diverted to the illicit drug trade, started thinking about creatively ways to use it. They
Yeah.
would dry it, grind it up, make cakes out it like grind to this green powder is almost like matcha. We make cakes and ice creams and cookies out of it, all the and drinks, all these different things. But it was very expensive to do. But I saw that these high-end restaurants like Gusto and La Paz, who were cooking with coca leaf, and to this restaurant Gusto was actually started by one of the partners of Noma, of Renee
Klaus
Redzepi and
Meyer.
Noma, Klaus Meyer, and it was eventually turned over and run by Bolivians themselves, and Marcia Taha kind of revolutionized the way that Gusto is run now, and it's much more I want to say like Sean Sherman and
Right.
Awamni here in Minneapolis and his foundation Natives, that is working with indigenous communities to grow and produce indigenous ingredients that he can use for his restaurants. And Marcia has been doing that. Well, she's now left Gustu, but working with the foundation to build pipelines of indigenous ingredients into restaurants into Bolivia as a
Yeah.
way to kind of connect this whole ecosystem together. But it had you had I had seen that there had no way that Gustu that would be ever able to exist if it hadn't been for the women of the Moss to create the political context and the peace for Augusto to survive in La Paz and
Yeah.
others like it. And I remember asking in Chapari, women like Juana Quispe, who you meet in the book, she was a Moss activist and eventually a parliamentarian, but many others, what they thought about these high-end restaurants in Colombia, in Bogota, and Lima, and La Paz, restaurants that they could never afford in their lives, what they thought about these chefs using coca leaf. She's like, and they're like, what really struck me, and it was, I wasn't expecting this answer. It's like what? She's like, why should I be mad? This
Yeah.
is what we fought for. And if people
Yeah.
want to be creative with this, that's great. And but it's other people using coca leaf in different ways, but we created the space for them to do this. And this is our and they're happy that it's
Yeah.
like, but
Yeah.
I know it's kind of there's a tension that I dealt with there
Yeah.
all the time. I'm like, there's these really wonderful people who will never be able to taste this really wonderful thing that can afford it. But like I said, Sean at Awamni has created, he reserves space in his restaurant all the time for people from his community who can't afford to eat there. And Marcia
Nice.
is doing that now in her own restaurant and has done that with Gusto. So there is some kind of avenues for people to do this. But yeah, it's been an uphill battle for a lot of them.
Yeah. No, but I love that you really you let it speak for itself and you let it sort of have that natural sort of conclusion without sort of imposing, but still naming the tension there. I thought that was
Yeah,
really good. Does anyone have any questions today? Any comments?
I had
Uh,
one.
yeah.
Michael, thank you so much for everything that you've shared.
my pleasure.
Your background is fascinating, and I've really appreciated the conversation. Um, I was really moved and got very emotional when you were talking about that woman who, needed to share that recipe with you. And I'm thinking about war and genocide as these, this ongoing grief for communities and various cultures. And I'm just wondering how you see like this work of preserving recipes or, having these conversations with people who've endured such grief, how it applies to like grief work and healing for these communities.
That's an awesome question. It's central in a lot of ways. And I'll talk about how it's being done by way of one example. In the Rohingya, who are, if you're not familiar with the Rohingya, they are a population of about 2 million worldwide, about 1.5 million in Myanmar. They are a Muslim ethnic group that have for generations been just beaten down by the Burmese military. And over the course of decades, but kind of most significantly in 2017, about 1 million were pushed across. The Burmese military carried out a genocide and pushed 1 million Rohingya across the border into Bangladesh. And the Rohingya came together and kind of just like how do we protect our own culture, right? How we don't want to lose things. And in Myanmar, there are dozens of ethnic groups. And the and if you're mostly Buddhist, some Christian, but if you're a Buddhist ethnic group, the Myanmar government built you a kind of ethnic museum, if you will, right? Museum that celebrated your culture. And the Rohingya, of course, never had one because they were discriminated against and never seen as real citizens of Myanmar. So the Rohingya went to the UN and said, listen, we want to have our own museum. We're going to be here for years. Can you help us build one? And they built this really wonderful thing called the Rohingya Cultural Memory Center. And it is a place where Rohingya can practice their music, practice their wood carving, practice their um, tapestry weaving, I'm a variety of other things, not cooking yet. It's been a source of tension, but it has been that center has been a major source of healing, I would say, and a major source of keeping the community whole. What I've learned through writing this book and talking to the Rohingya, in particular over my years working with many Rohingya groups, that once you move a community off its land, right, and particularly off it through over an international border, you disconnect them from their land, which so much of your culture is tied to, and immediately it becomes under threat. And you don't find aid agencies who work in these environments aware of that until much, much later, until so many people have kind of forgotten things or just not interested anymore. But the more that you can keep a culture intact, its food, its language, its music, its art, the more it has the more it has a more profound and stronger self-identity, the less the stronger it is and the less its ability to be preyed upon from other groups and other forms of violence, and less violence takes place inside, right? There's this, it's really kind of quite incredible phenomenon that I've seen within within different groups that have suffered kind of this kind of traumatic, life of refugee, being life of refugee and violence. But those that are able to maintain their culture more profoundly are able to kind of ward off more violence to them, both kind of domestic violence in particular, but also from kind of predatory violence on the outside. So yeah, it's a real argument for protecting culture and food in particular.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kia. Always,
Yeah, great question.
she's great. We know that. Anyone else have any questions before any comments, anything? Is the book coming out in paperback?
Yeah, it's less than a year old, so I don't know when that'll happen.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, but
But
I'm still kind of on book tour. It's like it's a slow
yeah,
burn. It's a slow burn. So I didn't really,
that's a good sign. That's a
yeah.
good sign. You don't want to have a big to do and then have it disappear and that sort of a thing.
Yeah,
So
all
that's
of a
always
sudden, like my
great.
March and April and May are like filled up with book talks. I was like, it's
Amazing.
like I gotta go. Like I'm trying to write a couple more proposals for different books or things,
Yeah.
and so, but now it's like, yeah. So I feel good about it, but it's
Yeah.
taken on its own life in a way.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, can you tell us what we were talking about when you were in Japan?
Yeah. So, two things. I was talking to some of the Ainu community in Hokkaido. They're an
Yeah.
indigenous group who have been long discriminated against. I mean, a similar history to Native Americans and other
Yeah.
indigenous communities in North and South America and globally. But I was just trying to get a sense and build some relationships and understand how they are kind of protecting and bringing back some of their lost traditions. And it was, a little bit of research for potential kind of follow up to this book or to another book idea I have. And that was really fascinating learning about, and it's just incredible food too.
Yeah.
Let's, I mean, we talk about violence and food, but a lot of this food is really fantastic. And like,
Yeah.
and it was a different part of Japan. I lived in Japan for years. It was a new part of Japan that I hadn't been to. And so it was there building relationships, talking to people, introducing who I was seeing if I could come back in the summertime and talk to them, if I'm able to get another version of this book. Yeah, and then I also was at a few universities, talking to students about how to get into careers in human rights and
Yeah.
development. It wasn't something that I was taught at my university and at college, and like I didn't know I could have a career like mine.
Yeah.
And so I was talking to young students about pathways into this and career advice and writing advice. Yeah, so that was
Yeah.
my 2 weeks in Japan.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I mean, did you expect to be a writer or was that intentional or was it sort of incidental?
Um, a little bit of both.
Yeah.
So the organizations that I worked for are their main focus is on writing to change policymakers' mind, and to get them to do something. And I'll admit, I get very frustrated. Like there hasn't been a lot of war criminals brought to the Hague and
Hmm.
prosecuted and put away. It kind of beat me down a little bit. From a morale perspective. And so part of the reasons that I wanted to do this was to write this book was to be able to tell a better story. I
Yeah.
found food to be an easier way into hard topics,
Yeah.
and it was a way to bring in, a broader community, everyday
Yeah.
people into the human rights world in a way that is kind of hard. And so I wanted to do human rights on kind of my own terms,
Yeah.
like not. And so the idea of this book was always to have a book and to kind of have a small foundation that would take the book money and give it back into the communities that are talked about in this book, but also are adjacent to this book in some ways. And then,
Yeah.
maybe do something more visual, like a television show or something, to all kind of put this together and kind of like a more a broader way to tell this story and reach more people.
Yeah.
But that's kind of been the aim of it, to not just to get more people engaged
Yeah.
in these stories and these communities that our government, and particularly my government. I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
sure if everyone here is American, but I wanted to make sure that hold us to
Yeah.
account,
Yeah.
and build some compassion and camaraderie with communities that we may not know about.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, that's exciting. The TV, I think you have the voice, you have the demeanor for it, right? Have you had pushback from folks about whether food is the right avenue into these stories?
No, I haven't.
Oh,
Most people have been receptive.
cool.
I think some of the pushback that I have gotten has been around why I didn't include certain conflicts in this
Right.
book.
Yes, yes.
And again, one in particular is why I'm not talking about Gaza or the
Yeah.
West Bank. I have never been to Gaza or the West Bank. I don't feel like I have standing to talk about it. There are
Yeah.
wonderful people who are doing this work, like Layla Al Haddad and
Yeah.
Reem Kassis, that are doing this. But yeah, this is mostly where I feel that I have some knowledge where I've worked and I have some credibility on working on these places,
Yeah.
and with these people. So yeah,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's kind of the pushback I've gotten.
No, and I said this when I wrote my little book notes, but like I do love how your book really enacts so many of these ideas that I think are that we talk a lot about in food, like maybe food studies or food scholarship, but we don't see it kind of come to life in the same way that it comes to life in your book, which is really useful and really
Thank you.
enjoyable, and you make it very pleasurable to read. And I'm always thinking, and I'm if like folks who read me are like maybe an I don't know. At this point, I'm like a broken record on like the importance of the idea of like a decent meal from Hannah Garth, she has a new book out called Food Justice Undone. But like you take that concept of like food is more than nutrition and just really, really, really dig into it and really and I loved also what you said in that interview with Lori Woolever about like it's not the food itself that's political, it's like what happens. And like it's just so important to have these conversations, I think, especially right now because of ongoing conflict, because of what we're enduring in the United States as well. And I just think it's such an important book and it gives us a really great framework for these conversations. So I just really appreciate your work.
Oh, thank you very much. No, it's been an honor to be part of this. Thank you.
No, it's so great. And thank you all so much for coming today. And the video will be out in a few weeks whenever I get to it. Frankly, whenever I get to it, I've given myself too much work right now. But awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. And I hope you get back to work to New York soon.
Yeah, I think we're gonna be able to fly this evening.
After the snow is
Yeah,
gone, maybe. Yeah.
yeah. Thank you, no, Alicia. It's been an honor to be part, like not only like to be a member of your newsletter and read everything, but to be part of this.
Yeah.
This was a real highlight of like releasing this book. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm so glad hopefully we get more folks reading the book. Spread it around. All right. Thank you,
Thank you
everybody.
guys. It was nice seeing you all.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.